Jennings first appeared before the public with a bright smile, an innocent voice, and a confidence that seemed to astonish an entire nation. At the time, she was just a child who said she was a girl, and the world listened as if something historic had just been declared. Cameras turned on. Studio lights flooded her small face. In that moment, whether anyone realized it or not, Jazz's life quietly crossed a line from private childhood into public destiny. Years later, watching those early clips feels unsettling. It is difficult to separate what was genuine childhood innocence from what was already shaped by expectation. Jazz was no longer seen simply as a young person growing up. She became proof. She became an answer to a social debate still forming. Before she could understand the weight of identity, the world had already decided what her story meant. A silent question hovered from the very beginning, though few dared to say it out loud. What happens when a child becomes a movement before becoming a fully formed person? Jazz grew up surrounded by praise, interviews, applause, and admiration for her courage. Adults called her brave. Media outlets called her hope. Yet almost no one asked whether she was okay in the way children need to be asked. Behind the bright lights were quieter moments that never made it to television. Long days followed by exhaustion. The strange pressure of always being watched. The unspoken rule that she needed to represent something larger than herself. When a child is constantly reminded that millions are looking to her for reassurance, strength becomes an obligation rather than a choice. Jazz was not only living her life. She was performing certainty for an audience that needed her to be unwavering. As time passed, her body changed, her mind matured, and her emotions grew more complex. But unlike most children, Jazz experienced every stage of growing up under relentless observation. Decisions that might have remained private became public discussion points. Feelings that should have been explored quietly were analyzed on screens. Every reaction, every hesitation was given meaning by strangers. Over time, silence became safer than honesty. There were moments when that silence cracked. Jazz admitted that her thoughts would not stop racing, that some days she felt overwhelmed and on the verge of tears. These confessions appeared briefly, often softened by reassuring music and hopeful commentary. Everything would be fine. She was doing great. She was inspiring people. But emotional pain does not disappear simply because it does not fit a narrative. Entering adolescence, the sense of being carried by forces beyond her control intensified. Doctors, parents, producers, and advocates surrounded her, each convinced they were acting in her best interest. Choices were framed as necessary, urgent, and unquestionably right. Yet urgency leaves little space for uncertainty. And uncertainty is a natural part of growing up. At times, Jazz expressed a feeling that her life no longer belonged entirely to her. It was not rejection of who she was, but confusion about how little room she had been given to question, to pause, to explore quietly. The language of certainty had been imposed so early that doubt felt almost forbidden. To hesitate was to disappoint someone. To struggle was to risk undermining a cause larger than herself. The pressure accumulated slowly, almost invisibly. Being labeled strong meant there was no room to be weak. Being celebrated as a symbol meant mistakes felt dangerous. Jazz learned how to smile through discomfort, how to reassure others even when she herself felt lost. The applause that once felt empowering began to sound distant, hollow, as if it belonged to someone else's life. What makes this story unsettling is not a single dramatic event, but the gradual erosion of privacy and choice. A childhood lived on display leaves little room for self-discovery without witnesses. Jazz was growing up, but she was doing so inside a story that had already been written around her. From the outside, everything appeared triumphant. A smiling young face representing progress. A narrative of success repeated again and again. Yet beneath that surface, a quieter reality was forming. One shaped by pressure, expectation, and the absence of a simple right to be unsure. This is where the story truly begins. Not with answers, but with unease. Not with conclusions, but with a sense that something fragile was being asked to carry far too much weight. The smile that once captivated millions had not disappeared, but it had grown tired. Long before the cameras arrived, before the interviews and applause, Jazz's world was small and ordinary in ways that now feel almost unreal. Home was where routines formed, where childhood habits took root, where identity was first expressed not as a political statement, but as a simple insistence. She gravitated toward what felt natural to her, long before language like representation or advocacy entered the room. To her, it was never an argument. It was a feeling, clear and persistent, spoken with the blunt honesty only children possess. Her family watched closely, trying to interpret something no parenting book could truly explain. Love guided their decisions, but so did fear. Fear of causing pain, fear of doing too little, fear of doing too much. As Jazz grew more adamant, the household shifted around her needs. Clothing, names, pronouns, daily rituals quietly rearranged themselves. In those early years, it felt intimate, protective, and deeply personal, a family responding to one child's distress in the best way they knew how. Yet even then, the outside world was waiting. Curiosity arrived disguised as concern. Journalists framed the story as extraordinary, unprecedented, hopeful. The first interviews felt harmless, even validating. A young child explaining her feelings with remarkable clarity seemed to reassure adults searching for certainty. Praise came easily. Strangers spoke about courage, about progress, about history being made. The words sounded generous, but they carried expectations Jazz could not yet understand. As the attention grew, so did the structure around her life. Schedules became tighter. Conversations became more careful. Every appearance had a purpose, every moment a message. Childhood began to lose its looseness. Playtime and school blended with rehearsed explanations and carefully chosen words. Jazz learned what people wanted to hear, and she learned how to say it well. The skill was praised as maturity, though it came at the cost of spontaneity. Inside the home, dynamics subtly shifted. Support became coordination. Concern became planning. Decisions were no longer just about what felt right today, but about what the future required. Medical appointments replaced some of the rhythms of ordinary adolescence. Discussions about growth and development carried a gravity that most children her age never encounter. Jazz listened as adults spoke about timelines and outcomes, absorbing their certainty even as her own inner world grew more complicated. Success arrived early, but it was a specific kind of success. Not academic, not artistic, but symbolic. Jazz was celebrated for existing correctly, for embodying a narrative that others needed to believe in. She was told that her story helped people, that it changed minds, that it saved lives. Those statements are powerful, but they leave little space for failure or confusion. When your identity is framed as a solution, any doubt feels like betrayal. As she entered her teenage years, the contrast between public confidence and private uncertainty widened. Adolescence is typically a time of experimentation, of trying on and discarding versions of the self. For Jazz, experimentation felt risky. Her identity had already been affirmed, defended, and broadcast. There was no neutral ground left to explore quietly. Questions that might arise naturally were often redirected or softened, framed as temporary anxieties rather than signals worth examining. School life offered no full escape. Recognition followed her into hallways and classrooms. Some peers admired her, others resented the attention, still others did not know how to interact at all. Normal teenage awkwardness was amplified by visibility. Every social interaction carried an extra layer of interpretation. Jazz learned to retreat inward, conserving energy, limiting exposure, protecting herself from reactions she could not control. There were moments when the pressure surfaced unexpectedly. A tired look lingering too long. A hesitation before answering a question she had answered 100 times before. These moments were rarely lingered on. The story needed momentum, optimism, reassurance. Editing smoothed out rough edges. Difficult emotions were acknowledged briefly, then redirected toward resilience. Struggle was acceptable only if it ended neatly. What makes this period so crucial is not any single decision, but the environment that shaped them. Jazz grew up in a world that prized certainty over curiosity. The narrative surrounding her did not encourage waiting or wandering. It encouraged progress, clarity, and consistency. Growth was expected to follow a straight line, even as her internal experience did not. Over time, Jazz began to internalize the expectations placed upon her. She learned to evaluate herself through the eyes of others, measuring her worth by how well she fulfilled the role assigned to her. Strength became synonymous with silence. Vulnerability became something to manage rather than express. The idea of stepping back, of slowing down, felt almost impossible. Looking back, this chapter of her life reads less like a childhood and more like preparation. Preparation for debates she never asked to join. Preparation for scrutiny she never consented to fully understand. The foundation was laid not just for who she was, but for what the world needed her to represent. By the time Jazz reached the threshold of adulthood, the weight of that foundation was already pressing down. The questions she had postponed did not disappear. They waited, growing heavier with time, ready to surface when momentum finally slowed. The shift did not announce itself with a single headline or a dramatic collapse. It arrived quietly, layered beneath years of momentum, until the distance between who Jazz was expected to be and how she actually felt became impossible to ignore. By the time she reached late adolescence, the pace of her life had accelerated beyond anything she could control. What once felt like guidance now felt like inevitability. Decisions were no longer framed as choices, but as milestones waiting to be checked off. Medical rooms replaced familiar spaces. Conversations grew more technical, more final. Adults spoke in calm, reassuring tones, outlining next steps as if they were natural conclusions rather than turning points. Jazz listened, nodded, absorbed. She had learned long ago that hesitation invited concern, and concern quickly turned into persuasion. When everyone around you is certain, uncertainty begins to feel like a personal failure. On the surface, everything appeared aligned. The story made sense to those watching. This was progress unfolding as promised. Yet internally, something had begun to fracture. Jazz started recording private thoughts, moments of honesty meant for no one else. In these recordings, her voice sounded different, slower, heavier. She spoke of feeling disconnected, of sensing a gap between her outer presentation and her inner experience. It was not a declaration of regret, but it was not confidence either. It was confusion, raw and unresolved. Those moments surfaced briefly on screen, framed as temporary struggles. The audience was reassured that doubt was normal, that everything would soon feel right again. But doubt did not fade. It lingered. It grew sharper as irreversible decisions drew closer. There was little space to stop, to sit with fear, to ask what would happen if the path paused here. Momentum had its own logic, and it demanded continuation. When the surgery was finally scheduled, it was described as a culmination, a finish line, years of preparation, advocacy, and medical planning converging into a single event that promised completion. Publicly, it was celebrated as historic. Privately, Jazz carried a quiet dread she struggled to articulate. The language around her left no room for ambivalence. This was supposed to be the moment everything aligned. The reality was far more complex. The physical experience was harsher than anticipated. Pain lingered longer than expected. Healing was uneven. Complications followed, then corrections, then more waiting. Each procedure extended the recovery, not just of the body, but of the mind. The sense of relief she had been promised did not arrive on schedule. Instead, exhaustion set in, deep and persistent. Between hospital rooms and recovery beds, Jazz began to withdraw. The energy she once used to reassure others was gone. Conversations felt draining. Appearances became burdensome. She spoke less, smiled less, moved through days with a kind of numbness that worried those closest to her. The cameras captured fragments of this change, but could not fully convey the weight of it. What followed was not dramatic collapse, but slow unraveling. Food became comfort, then escape. Eating filled the silence when words failed. Weight accumulated quietly at first, then rapidly. Each change in her body became another source of scrutiny, another layer of self-consciousness. She spoke openly about feeling out of control, about using food to manage emotions she could no longer name. Depression settled in, heavy and unrelenting. Daily routines began to fracture. Getting out of bed felt overwhelming. Tasks that once felt automatic required effort. Therapy sessions blurred together. Progress was measured in inches, setbacks in miles. Those around her tried to help, but help often came in the form of reminders, expectations, and concern that felt indistinguishable from pressure. There were confrontations, moments when frustration spilled into the open, love mixed with exhaustion, support tangled with resentment. Years of carrying a shared mission had left everyone tired. Jazz listened as others expressed fear for her future, fear that she was slipping away. She wanted to respond, to reassure them, but she no longer had the words. The academic path she had worked toward became another casualty of timing. Acceptance letters that once symbolized triumph now felt like obligations she could not meet. She chose to step back, citing the need to heal. To many watching, the decision was shocking. To Jazz, it was survival. The pace she had maintained for most of her life was unsustainable. As the spotlight dimmed, a strange quiet settled in. Without constant attention, there was space to feel the full weight of what had happened. The years of being watched, guided, and celebrated left little room for grief. Now, grief arrived without warning. Grief for a childhood never lived privately. Grief for versions of herself she never had the chance to explore. Grief for certainty lost. The world outside began to react in predictable ways. Some framed her struggles as evidence of systemic failure. Others dismissed them as external pressure rather than internal conflict. Very few listened to Jazz herself. Her pain was once again interpreted through competing narratives. She became a symbol in reverse, used to argue positions she had never claimed to hold. Caught between these forces, Jazz retreated further inward. She spoke of wanting simplicity, of wanting to exist without explanation. The desire was modest, almost invisible, yet profoundly difficult to achieve. Her life had been defined by meaning imposed from the outside. Letting go of that meaning felt like another loss. This period marked a turning point, not because of a single event, but because the cost of everything that came before could no longer be ignored. The story that once moved effortlessly forward stalled under its own weight. What remained was a young woman facing the consequences of a life lived too quickly, under too many eyes, with too little room to change her mind. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They unfolded slowly, touching every corner of Jazz's life in ways that were difficult to measure and even harder to repair. What had once been framed as resilience now revealed itself as fatigue. The strength she had been praised for so often became a quiet liability, masking the depth of what she was enduring until the damage could no longer be ignored. Physically, her body bore the marks of years of intervention and recovery. Healing was not linear. Pain resurfaced without warning, energy fluctuated, and routine activities demanded more effort than they once had. Medical follow-ups became part of the background noise of daily life, reminders that some decisions echo far beyond the moment they are made. The promise of closure had been replaced by maintenance, by an ongoing relationship with a body that no longer felt entirely familiar. Emotionally, the toll was heavier still. Depression did not present itself as a single crisis, but as a constant weight, dulling motivation and narrowing perspective. Days blended together. Joy felt distant, something remembered rather than experienced. Jazz described feeling disconnected, as though she were watching her own life from the outside. That sense of detachment made it difficult to trust her emotions or to believe that relief was possible. Relationships shifted under this strain. Family members who had once stood united began to show signs of exhaustion. Support was still there, but it carried an edge of worry and frustration. Conversations became charged. Silence grew longer. Love remained, but it was complicated by years of shared decisions that could not be undone. Each person carried their own version of responsibility, their own private doubts. Public reaction added another layer of pressure. Observers dissected Jazz's appearance, her weight, her expressions, searching for meaning in every change. Some voices expressed sympathy, others judgment. Many spoke about her as if she were an abstract lesson rather than a person still trying to heal. The loss of privacy that defined her childhood did not disappear when the cameras faded. It simply took on new forms. Opportunities that once symbolized possibility now felt overwhelming. The future, long imagined as bright and assured, appeared uncertain. Academic ambitions were postponed. Professional paths blurred. Time that might have been spent exploring interests or building independence was redirected toward recovery and self-preservation. Progress became measured not by achievements, but by survival. Social isolation deepened the impact. Friends moved forward with their lives, while Jazz remained anchored to processes of healing that few could fully understand. Invitations dwindled. Connections weakened. Loneliness settled in, quiet and persistent. The world felt smaller, yet more demanding than ever. Perhaps the most profound consequence was internal. Jazz began to question not only her choices, but her sense of agency. When so many decisions had been made within tightly defined narratives, reclaiming ownership of her life felt unfamiliar. The simple act of asking what she wanted became complicated. Desire had been shaped for so long by expectation that separating the two required effort and patience. The narrative surrounding her struggles continued to evolve without her consent. Competing interpretations battled for dominance, each claiming to explain her pain. In this noise, her own voice risked being drowned out once again. Speaking honestly meant risking misinterpretation. Remaining silent meant being spoken for. Either option carried a cost. Over time, the accumulation of these consequences forced a reckoning, not with identity itself, but with the systems and expectations that had surrounded it. Jazz's experience highlighted how easily care can blur into control, how support can harden into obligation. The aftermath was not a verdict, but a reality shaped by years of momentum and certainty. Healing, when it came, did not resemble triumph. It was quiet, uneven, and deeply personal. Small victories mattered more than public milestones. Rest became an achievement. Reflection replaced performance. In the absence of applause, Jazz faced the difficult work of understanding herself without an audience. This phase of her life revealed what had been hidden beneath the surface all along. That even well-intentioned paths can leave lasting scars. That being celebrated does not protect someone from pain, and that the consequences of growing up under constant scrutiny extend far beyond what is visible. Away from the edited scenes and public conversations, there were quieter stories unfolding that few people ever saw. These moments did not fit neatly into a narrative of progress or recovery, so they often remained unspoken, shared only in fragments or hinted at in passing. Yet it was within these private spaces that the true weight of Jazz's experience became most visible. There were nights when sleep refused to come, when thoughts looped endlessly without resolution. In those hours, Jazz confronted questions she had postponed for years. Not questions about identity in the abstract, but about selfhood in its most basic sense. Who was she when no one was watching? Who was she when there was no message to deliver, no audience to reassure? The silence that followed those questions felt heavy, but it was also honest. Some of the most revealing moments occurred not during emotional breakdowns, but in ordinary routines. Standing in the kitchen, unsure of what to eat. Sitting in therapy sessions where words stalled before reaching the surface. Taking walks alone, headphones on, using music as a shield against intrusive thoughts. These were not dramatic scenes, but they carried a quiet intensity that spoke volumes about the internal work she was attempting. People close to Jazz noticed subtle changes. Friends described her as more withdrawn, less eager to explain herself. Conversations that once flowed easily now felt cautious, interrupted by long pauses. She listened more than she spoke, as if weighing each word before deciding whether it was safe to release. Trust, once extended freely, had become something she guarded carefully. In moments of honesty, Jazz admitted that much of her exhaustion came not from a single hardship, but from years of emotional vigilance. She had learned early how to anticipate reactions, how to soften statements, how to frame her feelings in ways that would not alarm or disappoint others. Over time, that constant self-monitoring drained her. It became difficult to distinguish genuine emotion from learned responses. There were also unspoken tensions within her closest relationships. Love remained present, but it carried layers of complexity. Shared memories of advocacy and struggle created bonds that were difficult to untangle. At times, Jazz felt guilty for her pain, as if acknowledging it meant questioning the sacrifices others had made on her behalf. That guilt often kept her silent, even when she needed support the most. Recovery did not follow a straight path. Some days felt lighter, filled with small sparks of hope. Other days felt stagnant, as if progress had reversed overnight. Jazz learned that healing was less about reaching a destination and more about tolerating uncertainty. The idea of being unfinished, of not having clear answers, was both frightening and strangely liberating. In private reflections, she spoke about the grief she carried. Not grief for a single loss, but for possibilities that would never be known. A childhood without cameras. Adolescence without expectation. The freedom to change her mind without consequence. These losses were intangible, difficult to articulate, yet deeply felt. There were moments when she questioned whether she had ever truly been allowed to pause, to simply exist without purpose, to be confused without explanation. The realization was painful, but it also marked a shift. For the first time, Jazz began to see uncertainty not as failure, but as a necessary part of reclaiming herself. Small acts of autonomy became meaningful, choosing when to engage and when to step back, setting boundaries, even when they disappointed others, allowing herself to say no without justification. These actions may have seemed minor from the outside, but for Jazz, they represented a quiet reclaiming of control. The stories that emerged during this period were not dramatic revelations. They were fragments, pieces of a larger internal process that resisted simplification. They revealed a young woman learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to listen to herself after years of being spoken for. What makes these moments so important is their ordinariness. They remind us that healing does not always announce itself with visible transformation. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like withdrawal. Sometimes it looks like uncertainty embraced rather than avoided. Jazz's quieter journey challenged the expectations placed upon her once again. There was no clear lesson, no inspirational arc to package neatly. Instead, there was a person navigating complexity in real time, making peace with ambiguity and learning that worth does not depend on clarity or certainty. These unseen chapters may never fully be told, but they shaped everything that followed. They laid the groundwork for a different kind of future, one not defined by symbols or debates, but by the slow, deliberate process of becoming. As time passed, the meaning of Jazz's story began to shift, not because the facts changed, but because the lens through which they were viewed grew wider. What once seemed like a straightforward narrative of progress now appeared layered, complex, and unresolved. The question was no longer about milestones achieved or barriers broken, but about what had been exchanged along the way. Jazz's public legacy had been shaped early. She was introduced to the world as evidence that understanding and affirmation could transform lives. For many, her visibility offered comfort, validation, and hope. That impact was real, and it mattered. Yet legacies are rarely singular. They carry both light and shadow, success and cost. Over time, it became clear that Jazz's influence could not be measured solely by what she represented to others, but by what the journey had taken from her. Her life highlighted a tension that society struggles to acknowledge. The desire for clear narratives often clashes with the reality of human development. Growth is uneven. Identity evolves. Certainty shifts. Jazz's experience challenged the assumption that early clarity guarantees lifelong peace. It forced a reconsideration of how quickly answers are demanded and how uncomfortable we become when those answers begin to soften. There's a tendency to frame stories like hers in extremes, either as proof that a system works flawlessly or as evidence that it fails catastrophically. Both interpretations flatten the truth. Jazz's life resists simple conclusions. Her struggles do not negate her identity, nor do her achievements erase her pain. The legacy she carries exists in that uncomfortable middle ground where contradictions coexist. In reflecting on her journey, one lesson emerges quietly but persistently. Children need time. Time to explore. Time to doubt. Time to change without consequence. When that time is replaced by expectation, even the most well-intentioned support can become a burden. Jazz's story does not argue against care or compassion. It calls for patience, humility, and restraint. Her experience also raises broader questions about responsibility. When a young person becomes a symbol, who bears the weight if the symbol cracks? Is it the family who tried to protect? The professionals who followed prevailing standards? The media that amplified a compelling story? Or the audience that demanded certainty? Responsibility, like legacy, is shared and often unspoken. Despite everything, Jazz has continued forward, not as a polished emblem of success, but as a person learning how to live beyond expectations. Her willingness to speak openly about confusion, disconnection, and emotional fatigue offers a different kind of contribution. One rooted not in answers, but in honesty, in acknowledging that fulfillment is not guaranteed by alignment alone, and that healing rarely follows a script. There's something quietly powerful in that shift. By stepping away from the role of certainty, Jazz began to model a more realistic form of resilience, one that allows for rest, one that accepts uncertainty, one that values self-understanding over performance. This may ultimately become her most meaningful legacy. Her story invites reflection rather than judgment. It asks society to examine its impatience with complexity and its hunger for icons. It challenges the idea that visibility is always empowering, especially when it arrives before autonomy is fully formed. And it reminds us that progress measured in headlines can overlook the quieter costs paid by individuals. In this way, Jazz's journey becomes less about one person and more about a collective reckoning, a reconsideration of how we support young people navigating identity under public scrutiny, a reminder that care must leave room for pause, and that growth should never be rushed to satisfy external narratives. The legacy unfolding now is still incomplete. It is being written slowly, through reflection rather than spectacle, through lived experience rather than slogans. Jazz's story does not end with certainty or closure. It continues with questions, humility, and the ongoing work of becoming. As the noise gradually faded and the cameras turned away, what remained was not a conclusion, but a person standing quietly in the aftermath of a life lived under constant interpretation. Jazz was no longer the centerpiece of debates or the headline that demanded attention. For the first time, the urgency that had shaped her existence began to loosen its grip. In that space, something unfamiliar emerged. Silence. Not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of possibility. Without the pressure to perform certainty, Jazz faced the difficult task of redefining herself on her own terms. There were no scripts to follow, no expectations to meet, no audience waiting for reassurance. The absence of structure felt disorienting at first. When identity has long been reinforced by repetition and validation, stepping away can feel like losing balance. Yet it was within this instability that a different kind of strength began to take shape. The story that once seemed complete revealed itself as unfinished. Jazz did not arrive at clarity through dramatic revelation. Instead, she learned to tolerate not knowing. Days were shaped by small choices rather than symbolic gestures. Progress was measured in quiet persistence, in showing up for herself without explanation. The urgency to represent something larger slowly gave way to the need to simply exist. Looking back, the cost of turning a child into a symbol becomes painfully clear. Symbols are rigid. They do not grow or contradict themselves. People do. Jazz's struggle exposed the danger of confusing visibility with empowerment, of assuming that applause equates to protection. Her experience reminds us that admiration can coexist with harm, and that even supportive intentions can overwhelm when they leave no room for retreat. What remains most striking is not the controversy that surrounded her life, but the humanity that was often overlooked. Jazz was never meant to answer society's questions. She was meant to grow, to stumble, to revise herself freely. When that freedom is delayed or denied, the consequences ripple outward, touching families, communities, and cultural conversations in ways that linger long after the spotlight moves on. Today, Jazz continues quietly. She speaks about mental health, about self-compassion, about the importance of listening inward rather than outward. There's less urgency in her voice, less need to convince. What replaces it is a gentler honesty, one that does not promise solutions but invites understanding. She is no longer trying to resolve debates. She's trying to live. Her journey leaves us with questions rather than answers. Questions about how society treats children who become symbols, about the pace at which we demand certainty from lives still unfolding, about the line between support and control. These questions do not belong to Jazz alone. They belong to everyone who watched, applauded, debated, and moved on. The temptation is to frame her story as a warning or a verdict, but doing so risks repeating the same mistake, reducing a complex life to a single lesson. Jazz's experience resists that simplification. It asks for reflection instead of judgment, patience instead of certainty, humility instead of slogans. In the end, the most powerful part of her story may be the one still being written. A life no longer defined by expectations, but by gradual self-discovery. A future shaped not by what others need her to represent, but by what she needs to heal and grow. That process is slow, uncertain, and deeply personal. And perhaps that is the quiet truth her journey reveals. That no movement, no narrative, no cause should ever require a child to sacrifice their right to become a person in their own time. That growth cannot be rushed without consequence. And that sometimes the bravest thing is not to stand at the center of attention, but to step away from it. The story does not end with applause or condemnation. It ends with a question left deliberately open. What happens when we finally allow people to be human, even when their humanity refuses to fit the stories we want to tell?